When I first moved to Pennsylvania, we had a children's club in our church called Light Bearers. And their theme verse was Matthew 5:16. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. That's our motivation. Our motivation for everything we do, who we are, is that people would glorify our Father who is in heaven. Now, how do we glorify? Glorify just means to recognize who He is. We don't give anything to God. We don't do anything for God. We're just recognizing who He is so other people can see that. That's how we glorify Him. That's what our praise is all about. So He talks to us about how we can do that. We've been in the context of the Beatitudes, where Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talking to His disciples to tell them what it is they need to be. Christianity is not about what you do. It's about who you are.
Amen.
Now, who you are changes what you do. There's no question of that. And so next week we'll be talking more detail as he goes into detailed information about things that we do because of who we are. But first of all, he wants to let us know who we are. As we've talked about these different things that describe who God is, and they're the same things that ought to be true of us. As he went through the Beatitudes, he said we're blessed, just as God is blessed. You can only be blessed if you're in God, because He's the only blessed one. So for us to be blessed, we have to be in Christ, in God, so that we can have all of these things be true about us, so that we can be truly blessed, because we're in Him. Then we're happy in and of ourselves, because He's in us. Happiness is the kind of happiness we're looking for, is the eternal happiness that exists no matter what's going on around us, no matter what's happening to us. It doesn't change because of who we are. And so today he's going to talk to us about two things about us as a group. Christians tend to like to think of themselves as individuals. But the Lord doesn't talk to us as individuals much in the New Testament. He talks to us as a group of Christians. And he talked to the disciples. He talked to them as disciples. We're told to function as a group. Today we call that the church. Christians function together in a group called the church. Well, they didn't call it back then the church. That didn't really happen until a little later. But the group, or the assembly, as Jesus would have called Israel, when he talked to Israel, they were talked to as a group, not as individuals. So when he talks to us here in verse 13, 14, 15, 16, he's talking to us as a group of Christians. We are to function like this. So let's just go ahead and read it first, then we'll go back. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand. It gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So he doesn't say you ought to be salt. He doesn't say you ought to be light. He says you are. You're salt. Now, if I call you salt today, you might say that's an insult. No, it's not. Actually, to be called salt would be, in their day and age, a very highly treasured thing. Salt was an expensive thing. In fact, when you seated people at your dinner table, like when Thanksgiving dinner, I don't know how you decided at your house who would sit where. Who sits at this chair? Who sits at that chair? How did you decide that? Well, wherever Mom put you, that's where you sit. Wherever Grandma had the name tags, that's where you sat. Or some people say, wherever the mashed potatoes are, that's where I'm sitting. Okay. My grandmother used to bring me an extra bowl of mashed potatoes because she loved me the most. And that was important because at my grandmother's house, there were almost 100 people there. It was crowded, okay? Grandma had 12 kids. And so there were a lot of kids in each of those families, and so when we all got together at Christmas and Thanksgiving, that was a joyous time. That was the best game of capture the flag I ever played in that. It was awesome. And it got so big that later on we had to move all the children down to the basement at the ping pong tables, and then all the adults sat upstairs, and you had your assigned seat. But I had my extra mashed potatoes because, and I don't care how you say potatoes, that's how I say it. Anyway, salt. That's how they determined where you sat. Because a rich person had a storeroom of salt. And the people that were the most highly treasured were placed the nearest to the salt room. If you were placed on the other end of the room, you knew you weren't very valued. You were valued by where you sat in relationship to the salt. Salt was so expensive, in fact, that it was used as a method of trade. Roman soldiers were paid with salt. If you didn't do a good job as a soldier, they said you weren't worth your salt. Hopefully they don't say that to you at work. We ought to be treasured. We ought to do our job. I'm glad they don't pay us in salt anymore, but that's what they used to pay with. Why? Because you needed it. You needed salt. Salt wasn't just for making your food taste better. It was to preserve your food and to prevent damage to your food and decay. But it also brought out the flavor. My kids like to watch cooking shows, and so we watch these I liked it too. And so we're watching the cooking show, and very often the judges will say, "Oh, your food was great, but you didn't salt it enough." And unbelievably, these great chefs could fail because they didn't salt the food enough. It's an important thing. I love salt on my food more than I should. And in fact, my wife will sometimes complain because I salt the food before I even taste it. And that's a no-no in their culture, okay? In my wife's family growing up, the first time I ever ate dinner at their house was a shocking thing, as we're having dinner for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons was because as I was sitting there eating my meal, all of a sudden I feel a nudge under the table. And I look, and it's my soon-to-be brother-in-law nudging me under the table, and he's got a salt shaker in his hand. I'm like, what's that about? And I had no idea what he's doing. He's like, quiet. And then when my mother-in-law went out to the kitchen to get something, then he confessed, you can't salt the food, so we pass it around under the table. Don't try this at home. No, anyway. So this is not a new problem, right? Salt, this has been a thing since creation. People have put salt on their food because what does it do? It brings out the flavor. You want to bring out that flavor. The salt isn't supposed to be the flavor, although I like that flavor, but it brings it out, and it also preserves food. So if you're out and you're going to be away from refrigeration for a long time, people would put salt on their pork or whatever to protect it and to keep it. So when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, he's talking about the influence that we're supposed to have. The same is true of the light. When we talk about light, we're talking about influence, okay? So we as Christians are supposed to have an influence in the world. He's not saying that you should be salt, as I said before. You are salt. And he's talking about saltiness as something that you can lose. He's not talking about that you can lose your salvation. He's talking about your influence, okay? So God has called us as the church, as Christians. We are to be in our world, not of it, but in the world, so that we can be influencers in the world. We can be salt in the world, and we can also be light. So we're talking about two different things here, okay? First of all, he talks about being salt. So we're going to bring out flavor, but we're also going to preserve something. You understand that if Christians aren't in the world gets worse than it is, quickly. And so we know that at the end of all things, when God takes the church out of the world, what's going to happen to the world? It's going to get very dark very quick. And so if you are in the world, one of the reasons that you are in the place that you are in as Christians, I could say as a Christian, but it's meant to be as Christians. We're to work together, okay? Don't be a loner Christian. I've talked to lots of Christians who say, well, I don't need other Christians. I don't need the church. It's just me and Christ. No, that's not how he didn't set it up that way, okay? That's not what his plan was. His plan was for Christians to work together. He gave the gifts to the church, not to individual Christians, okay? Everything's to us as a group. So we are to be together the influencer in the world, not to be influenced by the world. And too much of the time we get influenced by the world. We get contaminated. And so salt that gets contaminated, is it still salt? Yeah, it's still salt. But what good is it? It's not good at all. And so now they had the salt that they used in those days. There was different sources for that salt. One of the greatest sources of the salt was the Salt Sea, the Dead Sea. So you go and you take that salt, and while it was good salt, it wasn't completely pure salt. It was contaminated by the sulfur in the gypsum especially. So if you have salt that's contaminated with gypsum, the more contaminated it is, the less useful it is. And so there was a man who, in history past, who had a large room, and he was storing up his wealth. And so one of the things that you stored up was salt. And so he took a lot of salt and put it in this room, but he put it on the dirt floor. And he came back later and found that that salt was all useless because it had been contaminated by the dirt over time. It became useless. So do you know what they did with salt that was useless? You can't just throw it out in your garden, because what's going to happen? It's going to kill the plants. So some people, when they wanted to kill someone else's plants, what would they do? Believe it or not, they did this. When you took over another army, you'd go and you'd ruin their land by spreading salt all over it. And that would kill their land, so they couldn't grow crops. And so that's contaminated salt. But if you had that in your own house and your salt became useless because it was contaminated, it wasn't kept pure, it wasn't refined, they would take that salt and they would throw it out into the street. Because where else are you going to put it? You don't want it on your land. You put it on the street. What's it good for? For people to walk on. That's all. That's the only way you could get rid of it. So Jesus talks about that. He says, verse 13, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. That's why it's trampled underfoot by men. You see, why did the salt, you think today, well, my salt up in the cupboard has been there 5 years, it's still good. Yeah, well, that was purified salt. That's different than what they had in their day. So contaminated salt's thrown out. Now, as a church, how can that be true of us? Is the Lord going to throw us out? No, He's not going to throw you out as far as losing your salvation. That's impossible. No one can take you out of His hand, right? But the Lord does talk about us losing our effectiveness. Remember the churches in the book of Revelation when He wrote to a number of them and said, if you do not change this, I will take away your lampstand. Oh, now he's getting into light, but we're not quite there yet. But He says, I will take away your lampstand. In other words, you won't be effective anymore. If you're not effective, I'll take away your opportunity to witness. You'll still be a Christian. You'll still be a group of Christians. But you won't have the opportunity anymore to be effective in the world because you're just not. So, what kind of influence do we have in the world around us? Are we the kind of salt? The question is never, are you salt? You are. The question is, what kind of salt are you? Well, now we've been put on the world. The Lord put us here in the world to have an influence in the world. The influence we ought to have is not coming from us. It's from Christ. It can lose the value. And we have to constantly ask ourselves the question, are we losing value? As a group of Christians, as a church, are we losing value? Now, as individual Christians, you never lose your value to the Lord, right? You're highly valued. Why are you valued? Because God looks at you and who does He see? Jesus Christ. Is there any chance you're going to lose your value? No. You're highly valuable to God. But can you lose your effectiveness? Absolutely. Can we as a church lose our effectiveness? Absolutely. When? When we're contaminated by the world. When we're being more influenced by the world's evil than we are influencing the evil of the world with the flavor of Christ. So we need to bring the flavor of Christ to the world. Now, one of the other things that salt does is it creates thirst. Salt is good for your body because you need water, don't you? I mean, you're mostly water. We are made up of water. That's what we are, okay? And salt helps us to retain that water. Now, you can have too much salt to retain too much water. That's not good. But we have to have the right amount of purified salt in us to retain the water. And so we recreate thirst in other people. But you know that you cannot create thirst in someone else if you don't have that thirst yourself. If you do not have a thirst for righteousness, and he just talked about that in Beatitudes, didn't he? He said we need to thirst for righteousness. And if we have that kind of thirst, we're going to create that kind of thirst in other people. It takes a pure influencer to influence those who need to be influenced by purity. Now, if you take a cup of water and you mix it with a cup of dirty water, what's going to happen? It's all going to be dirty water, all right? So if you want to have more influence on the dirt of the world, we need to be more pure, don't we? The more pure that we are and thirst we have for righteousness, the more effect that we can have. But we don't want to be cast aside as a church. We don't want the Lord to ever say, they're not being effective. He's going to take away their lampstand. No, we never want that. We want the Lord to use us so that we can have influence on the world. And so now he goes into another way of talking about that, and he says, you are the light of the world, verse 14. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. That's not a question. That's an answer. It's a statement. He said, listen, if you are a light, you can't hide that, okay? So when you're out in the darkness at night, and the darker it is, the more you can see the light. You know that. We were just out on a retreat, some of us up at Three Springs. We went for a nice wagon ride in the woods, and we're like, wow, you can see the stars so much better because there isn't all that pollution from the other distractions, and you can see that beauty up in the sky. And that's what we ought to be, that kind of light in the world. But we can get mixed up with the world and not be the light that we ought to be. But that's not the problem we usually have. The problem we usually have with the light is that we hide it. We hide it. Now, we have a great light source, Jesus. He's the light source. And he wants to shine through us. But so often we want to hide that from other people. There's no good reason for that, is there? There's never a good reason to hide the light. I mean, if you have a working light in your home, you don't put a basket over it. That's just kind of silly. Why would you put something to cover the light? You know, we have good lights nowadays. You have LED lights, you know, that work very efficiently, work very well. And you don't go around your house and cover all your lights. Like if your children went around and threw blankets over all your Christmas lights, what would you say? Stop it, you're going to start a fire. Okay. But you want that light to be out there. You want it to be beautiful. You want people to see it. But as Christians, we often hide the light of Christ in our lives because we are ashamed of it. We, men, love what? Darkness rather than light. Well, I thought that changed when we became a Christian. It should. But we still fight the flesh, don't we? The day I got saved, I didn't stop sinning that day. I didn't stop having an appetite for darkness that day. I still have it. I have to fight that until the day I go to heaven. But the Lord has given me His Spirit to give me the strength to lean on so I don't have to give in to those temptations. But often we're ashamed of Christ. We want to hide it. We don't want the world to be able to see the light that is in us. So what does he say about that? He says, no, you don't do that. You don't put a basket over the light. Instead, you put it on a lampstand. Now, isn't that an interesting word that he uses? Same word he uses in Revelation. lampstand? You have a stand to put your light on. What's the lampstand? Well, it's the church, mostly. The church is your lampstand. You put the light on that. You function together as a body of believers, as a lampstand, as a place to put that light on to let the world see it. Now, there are other opportunities that you have in your life, your work, your family. But guess what? Those are all part of the church. Did you know that? Did you know you don't have a personal life? You don't have one. Everything about your life is actually related to the church and speaks for the church. So when you go out into the workplace and people see how you do your job, that reflects on the church. Everything you do reflects on the church. You say, well, I'm not at church. There is no at church. Did you know there's no at church? Church is what? It's a body of believers. It's wherever you are. That's church, okay? So whatever you do, the attitudes you have, the way you treat people, your thirst for righteousness, your thirst for Christ, that all reflects on the church. And so we, as a light, ought to be on that lampstand reflecting the love of Jesus Christ and the glory of Jesus Christ. But we don't do that. And it doesn't matter what our position is. Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, I might have entered the ministry if certain clergymen did not look and act like undertakers. In other words, he looked out and the people that were supposed to represent Jesus Christ looked like they were miserable all the time, and that they're out declaring everybody else's misery. And he's like, if that's all I have to look at, forget it. Okay, so is that what people think when they look at us? We ought to think, when our children are around us, does that make them think better of Christ or less of Christ? When the children come in and amongst us, when the church is functioning, do they think more of the gospel or less of the gospel? Because of the way we treat each other, the way we help each other, the way we express the light of Jesus Christ. How does it make other people think? Are we being the salt? Are we being the light of the world with how we function in that way? Well, light does a couple of things. You probably didn't know that light does anything, did you? Light actually does some things. Light, first of all, reveals what is wrong. When you're going to go work on your car, you don't tend to do it at night, but every once in a while you have to, right? You got to go fix the car, and you got to go out there at light, and you got to bring a flashlight with you, don't you? Or you wear one of those headlight things, and so you can see what you're looking at. And so you have to hold the light just right to see down in there, see what you're doing. See, that light reveals what's wrong. You can't see what's wrong without that light in there. Surgeons nowadays, they go in to do surgery, and they have this little light that they put in there, and they can see what they're doing with that light or with that camera. So the light reveals what's wrong. It doesn't fix what's wrong, does it? It reveals it. Your job in the world is not to fix what's wrong. And sometimes we think it is. I've seen, okay, I admit it, we all do it, right? Sometimes I just want to fix everything. And so you go around and tell other people how they need to fix what's wrong in their life. That's not my job. Our job is to be the light. And just by our being like God, Ephesians chapter 5 that Jim read from, Ephesians chapter 5 says, be imitators of God, therefore, as dearly loved children. That's our job, to imitate God. And when we imitate God, that's being a light in the world. And that light of being like God reveals to other people what's wrong. You don't even have to say anything. It's just there. And so sinners get convicted, don't they? They get convicted because they realize, wait a second, that's what I'm supposed to be. This is what I am. Guess who else gets convicted? Christians. Have you ever been convicted of sin just by being with someone who that you knew they were living the light? It was obvious that the righteousness of Christ was in them. They were in a close walk with Jesus Christ. They didn't condemn you. They didn't tell you how to fix everything in your life. They were just being Christ-like, and it convicted you of the sin in your own life. That's the way it's supposed to be, see? Light reveals what's wrong. What else does light do? Light gives the opportunity for life to grow. You can't grow things without light, can you? It's necessary. You have to have it. So the light produces the opportunity for things to grow. And so as a church, we are the light of the world. We present the opportunity. We reveal what's wrong, but we also present the opportunity for life to grow. In our own lives, by being together, we present that opportunity because we bring the truth of Christ. The gospel produces that, doesn't it? The opportunity to grow. The gospel brings life. So, can I just go out there and just reveal what's wrong and never give opportunity for life? No, I need to do both, don't I? I have to be both things. So sometimes we have to preach the gospel. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a great thing. It's awesome. Like if you knew how to fix a major problem, would you just walk around and watch everybody else struggle? No. Some people do that. They just enjoy that, watching everybody else suffer. They don't know how to do this, and I know how to do that. Well, wouldn't it be great if you told everybody else so they could do it too? Yes, that would be great. And that's what the gospel is. We need to give it out to people so they can know, so they can see it. And so the Scripture tells us that we can appear as lights in the world. God gives us that opportunity. You can appear as lights in the world. He gives that a great opportunity. Here, Christians, you can appear as lights in the world. I'm not there, so you can do it. I will appear through you. I will send you out as Christmas lights in the darkness. And we say, well, do I have to? I don't know. I don't know if I want to do that. I mean, I get scared. I don't want people to know I'm a Christian. You have grandkids that pretend they, you play hide and seek. You can't see me. I see you. And the world sees you. Did you know that? When you're hiding and you think they can't tell, that you're a Christian that's hiding, they know. Did you know that people talk about you? They do. People talk about you. They talk about you as an individual, and they also talk about you as a church. People around talk about you, and they say, oh, did you know this about them? Well, I didn't ask you that. No, sometimes we're hiding. We're not being lights in the world. We think nobody can see us. Yes, they do. Jesus didn't say you ought to be the light. He said you are the light, okay? You are. People see you. But what kind of light are you giving? Are you giving the kind of light that He wants you to give? Or are you giving something totally different? Did you ever have a string of Christmas lights and one of them was blue? How hard would it be to pick the blue one? Would not be hard at all, okay? And sometimes that we do that as Christians. It's like, no one will see the difference. Yes, they do. Everybody sees the difference. They know that you're trying to hide. They know that you say you're a Christian. You've been saying that your whole life, but you've kind of been embarrassed by it every time you say it. You don't act that way at work. You don't act that way at school. As a youth pastor, I got very used to having teenagers that would come to the youth group and act one way, and the very next day at school it would be a completely different thing. And they'd think I didn't know that. Well, I did. I won't tell you all my secrets, but one of them is to have children in those grades. So I had one for each grade. No, that's not what happened. That's not. But guess who does know? Jesus knows. He knows where we are. He knows what we're doing. And He's not looking down on us in judgment. Don't think that. But He's looking down on you, and He knows what you could be doing. The opportunity He's given us to be a light in this world. And we're covering it. Now, one of the things that we often get confused about is there's two P's. One is programs, and the other one is passion. And the Lord is not looking for us to come up with programs to be a light and salt in the world, is He? He said, if you would just come up with the right program, you could really be the salt of the earth. No, that's not what it is. He just wants us to be passionate about Him. That's why this list that He gives here, the Beatitudes, it's not a list of things to do. He's saying, here's who you ought to be. If we'll just be passionate about being Christians, just be passionate about Christ, that's it. Just be that. And if we'll be that light that stands out in the crowd, that we don't try to hide it, we don't have to come up with programs. Now, there's nothing wrong with programs. Not what I'm saying, okay? We can come up with all the methodologies in the world to do things, and that's fine. Okay, we've got to organize ourselves because we're disorganized people. That's fine, all right? But that's not what the world needs. What the world needs, programs are for us. Okay, programs are to help us organize ourselves. But passion, that's for Christ. Passion. If we'll be passionate about Christ, if we'll be thirsty for righteousness, it's contagious. It shines that light into the world. It brings out the flavor. Did you know that there's flavor in the world? Even though the world is dark, there's still that flavor of the grace of God in the world, isn't there? We call that the general grace of God. It's that He gives us a certain amount of grace in the world. Otherwise, the world will be judged, squashed, done, right? And that will happen. That's in the future, okay? But God's given the world enough grace that it can exist. He still saves people physically. He still heals people, just in general, doesn't He? He still does miraculous things for people who aren't even Christians. That's just His general grace. He sends that out there. If that didn't happen, everything would just stop. But He does do it. But He's given us as lights to bring the special grace of God to people so that they can see that Jesus came and He died for us. He provided salvation for us. He cares. He loves us. And He wants to live with us forever. And so He just wants us to spread that news. And we go out and say, well, I'm ashamed of that. What? How can we be ashamed of the light that everyone needs? How can we try to hide the light that everyone needs? Why would we not want to go out as the salt of the world and make a difference, to bring out the flavor of the grace of Christ that's all over this world? The good things that God has put all over this world. That's for us to go out and do. It doesn't do it itself. Now, why God chose to do it that way, I don't know. But He did. So we ought not question His wisdom. And we ought to just be praising Him that He does, and that He lets us be a part of that. I mean, it's pretty fascinating. Now, the light that He allows us to shine in the world, He gives us opportunities to shine that in little other ways every once in a while, right? Every once in a while, because otherwise we would just kind of have the opportunity to shine the light in this like little couple blocks here, which is good. But every once in a while, He gives us an opportunity to branch out somewhere and shine a light in that place. And who knows how that happens? It sometimes happens through a missionary, right? John leaves for Spain again tomorrow. Pray for him as he travels. Pray for them as they're out there in Spain trying to plant a light out there in Ponferrada all by themselves. Pray for them. But it might be through you. Maybe your work calls you up and says, oh, we need you to take a trip to Dallas tomorrow. I don't want to do that. Oh, you got to go. Okay, so you can look at that two ways. Why do I have to go to Dallas? Or you can think, hey, God's going to let me shine a light in Dallas for a day. How am I going to do that? Awesome. He does that. Sometimes something that we think is a horrible thing happens. Why does that happen to me? I don't know. You may never know until you get to heaven. But you don't know the influence that God might use that to spread the light of the gospel somewhere where you would never have been. Some hospital somewhere. I was in an accident in the wintertime in Berwick. Like, who goes to Berwick, Pennsylvania? And I wound up in this tiny little hospital. Like, I couldn't even believe there was a hospital there, And God put me there, and my surgeon was a Christian. And he came and visited me and encouraged me and called someone else, and they came and prayed with me. I thought, that's awesome. God allowed them to be a light to someone that they would never have had to do that at all, but they did it. And they didn't know what kind of influence that would ever have, but it did. And God can use you in the same way. So he's called us not to be the salt. We are the salt. He's called us not to be the light. We are the light. So the challenge is, what kind of salt are you going to be? Are you going to be yucky, contaminated salt that's worthless and can throw it out? No, I don't want to be worthless to the Lord. Or are we going to be, what kind of light are we going to be? Are we going to be a light that everybody can see? Or am I going to hide it in a box? I used to drive a car that had hydraulic headlights. And you guys ever have those? I just want to see who's old like me. Okay, all right. Cougar. The headlights went. See, the light doesn't come up. Yeah, it did. So that's us, right? We're lights, but are we showing? Trying to hide that. Not to hide it. As a church, how are we going to be the salt of the earth? How are we going to be the light? That's our question to always think about and pray about. That God would direct us. And let's pray. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you that you gave us the opportunity to be these things, and you made us these things. You didn't ask us. You just made us the salt of the earth. And you made us the light of the world. What a great opportunity that is. Let us accept that challenge to be the best light, to be visible, to illuminate all that's around us with the light of Jesus Christ. Let us be the best kind of salt that's not contaminated. Let's not allow ourselves to be contaminated by the world so that we're useless. We want to be that pure salt, brings out the flavor. Help us to be that, Lord, as a church. Guide us and direct us that we will be passionate about you and that will be obvious to those around us. Thank you for all that you've given to us and all that you are to us. Help us rejoice in you throughout this week. In Jesus' name, amen. Have a great day. No rock zone tonight, so enjoy your holiday.